Mr. President, as senators begin debate on the budget, I want to briefly discuss why at this time I cannot in good conscience vote in favor of tax cuts, irrespective of their size or to which segment of the population they are targeted. Nor can I support any spending increases that are not related to improving our nation's defense from the obvious and serious threats facing us today. Let me stress, however, that I am, like my colleagues, concerned with the weakened state of our economy, and I don't dismiss lightly arguments in support of stimulating our economy with tax cuts. I know the negligible growth in our economy today has left many Americans without work, their investments and savings diminished, with lower standards of living, and that their elected representatives are expected to do something to help alleviate their suffering. I may have concerns that some parts of the administration's proposed tax cuts would not provide the near-term stimulus necessary to strengthen our obviously anemic economic recovery. However, I am certainly willing and even inclined to consider tax cuts that would provide a more immediate stimulus, such as, for instance, a reduction in payroll taxes, but not, Mr. President, at this time. The United States is currently engaged in a global war against terrorism and will in all likelihood soon commence a necessary war to disarm Iraq by destroying the regime of Saddam Hussein. The costs of these enterprises are not known with any degree of certainty at this time, nor are the costs we will incur after what I believe, what I fervently hope, will be a brief, successful war in Iraq as we seek to establish the foundations for a peaceful, stable, and democratizing Iraq. The administration has not provided the Congress with a realistic estimate of how much this worthwhile endeavor will cost the U.S. Treasury. I don't fault them for that. The costs are simply not knowable at this time. I believe the war in Iraq can be concluded successfully in a relatively brief time, but it's surely possible that the conflict won't meet our best estimates for its probable duration. It might take longer than we hope, or it may exceed our hopes. As any responsible war planner will tell you, it's always wise to expect the unexpected in war. Few battle plans have realized in their execution the planner's every assumption. Moreover, we don't know at this time how great will be the cost of meeting our responsibilities in a post-war Iraq, or with how many other countries that burden will be shared. The answer to those questions will depend more than anything else on how quickly and how thoroughly this military action succeeds. Also, if terrorist organizations use our action in Iraq as the occasion and the excuse to initiate new attacks against Americans at home and abroad, that too will put new pressures on our Treasury. What is already clear to me is that we will need to spend substantially more on our national defense in the long term than is currently envisioned, according to recent reports, in the budgets being marked up by the House and Senate budget committees. How much more will depend, of course, on the war's costs, but it will also depend on challenges from the continued threat from al-Qaeda and other associated terrorist groups, and from the aggressive actions by states hostile to the United States and our allies, which are intent on acquiring weapons of mass destruction such as North Korea. In addition, the costs of our security at home are great and certain to increase over the next few years. The war against al-Qaeda has been significantly successful. The President and his administration deserve great credit for that. But the enemy in our global war against terrorism is not yet vanquished. Speaking as a border state senator, with the challenges to better protect our borders so evident to Arizonans, I am acutely aware of how much more needs to be done to secure our homeland. Mr. President, even without assuming the costs of these various contingencies, particularly the war in Iraq and the responsibilities we will have in that country following the cessation of hostilities, the increase in the federal budget deficit envisioned over the next 10 years ought to concern greatly every member of Congress. In the first 5 months of fiscal year 2003, the U.S. government has already run up a $195 billion deficit. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that even without the President's tax cuts and without further increases in spending for the remainder of the fiscal year, the total budget deficit for 2003 will reach $246 billion. If we add the projected cost this year of the President's tax cuts, the deficit would reach $287 billion. Most alarming are the deficit projections for the next 10 years, incorporating the President's proposed tax cuts released by CBO last week, $1.8 trillion. Mr. President, that's a pretty staggering sum, and it doesn't include any of the costs of our imminent actions in Iraq. We should be concerned about deficits, Mr. President. They limit economic expansion by reducing the amount of national savings available for investment. This raises both interest rates and interest payments on the national debt. Deficits constrain our ability to respond effectively to unanticipated fiscal events. If we don't reduce them, projected long-term deficits will reach dangerous levels, lowering the national income and standards of living for future American generations. That said, Mr. President, I would still be open at some point to proposals to stimulate the economy with tax cuts, but not now. We should, Mr. President, take a pause in our efforts to increase spending on non-defense needs and to reduce taxes. However, I want to emphasize, we should take a pause in our efforts to increase spending on non-defense needs and to reduce taxes. However, I will not support the amendment by my friend from North Dakota to create a 60-vote budget point of order against any legislation that contains tax cuts or spending increases that would increase the deficit until the President submits to Congress a detailed report on the costs of our operations in Iraq. The way to address legitimate concerns with this budget resolution is not by creating new complicated points of order containing numerous exceptions and subject to very discretionary judgments about what is significant economic stimulus and what is an adequately detailed report on the costs of war and reconstruction in Iraq. The Senate should speak directly to these concerns now and vote for or against tax cuts and non-defense spending increase in this budget resolution. Should continued negligible economic growth require the stimulus offered by tax cuts later in this Congress, after, for a lack of a better metaphor, the dust has settled somewhat in our operations in Iraq, and Congress and the administration have a better understanding of the costs of war and peace incurred by the United States, senators can consider changes to fiscal policy at that time. However, while I don't foreclose future considerations of a tax cut to stimulate the economy, no one can be expected to make an informed decision on fiscal policy at this time with so many uncertain contingencies possibly on the horizon and with the near, mid, and long-term costs of defending this country unknown and presently unknowable. Let us wait until we have succeeded in Iraq, and until we have some idea of what percentage of the costs of the aftermath of those hostilities we will have to bear. The best thing that can be done for the economy today is to win the war in Iraq quickly, completely, and to attract the coalition of partners necessary to help us meet our post-war objectives in that country. That is a far more necessary and responsible stimulus to our economy at this time. And it is far sounder statesmanship than cutting taxes in the dark or running up spending without due regard to our primary responsibility to the American people, their fiscal security. Mr. President, I yield the floor.